This was a video that had a few errors in it. I've been a subscriber of Doug's for a long time, and despite the fact that he certainly has his own quirks and features, I can't help but respect his hustle. The thing is, nobody can truly have every single statistic of every single car memorized perfectly. And in his video about the Toyota MR2 here, he did get a couple of things wrong that I just wanted to clear up. So real quick, I want to go ahead and fact check a few things from the video, coming from somebody that has owned one of these cars for 18 years.
This is a really nice SW20 turbo in the best color from the final model year.
Actually, 1995 was the last year they sold the MR2 in the USA. In Canada, they stopped selling them in 1993, but overseas in Japan and other markets, they actually sold them all the way up until 1999. So technically, this 1995 model in this video is kind of right in the middle of the production run of the MR2.
Once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to visit the live auction.
I'm very interested to see what that car actually sells for in the Cars and Bids auction, because it's a pretty low mileage example, like 80,000 miles. I guess that's probably fairly similar to the mileage on mine. This is a newer model though, so this is gonna sell for more money for sure, but I'm curious to see what it sells for and what the market looks like on these cars nowadays when all of these Japanese cars are going through the roof.
The original model, the first generation, enthusiasts call it the AW11.
Enthusiasts don't call it the AW11, that's like the actual chassis code for it, just like SW20 is the chassis code for the second generation. It's also referred to as the Mark 1 and the Mark 2 and the Mark 3 MR2s, just like the Supras. Everybody's used to calling the newer Supras the Mark 5 and the ones that everybody loves the Mark 4. The MR2 was kind of the same story as well.
Now in this period, Toyota was making three different sporty performance cars. The MR2, the Celica, which was a similar size but not quite as focused, but still sporty and cool, and then the Supra at the top of the lineup. It was a totally different time, a totally different era.
Is it really that different of an era though? Because if you think about it, the Supra is still alive. We've got the current generation Supra, which you can now get in a 6-speed manual, which is awesome. And then there's also like the GR86, the GR Corolla kind of fits in the mix there too as a hot hatch. So I don't necessarily believe that it's fair to say that Toyota has kind of gotten boring since this era of their sports cars. I think they're still creating some pretty interesting sports cars. It's the mid-engine car that I think is standing out more, that we aren't seeing that anymore, obviously, but it seems like every year there's a new leak or a new rumor about the MR2 coming back, and whether or not that's going to be a mid-engine car. Honestly, nowadays, if it does come back, it's probably gonna be some stupid electric car or something like that, but we can only hope, right?
Now, the MR2 gets its name from, well, basically what it is. Mid-engine, rear-wheel drive car with 2 seats, MR2.
You know, a lot of people think that the name MR2 stands for mid-engine, rear-wheel drive, 2-seater, but the official word from Toyota themselves is that it stands for midship runabout 2-seater. So, very common misconception, and there's a few of those about this car out there. We're going to dig into a few more of them throughout this video.
But if you stepped up to this one, the turbo, you got a twin turbocharged 4-cylinder.
Oh, Doug. That is probably the biggest myth about the Toyota MR2 out there. Toyota never made a twin turbo MR2. Yes, the top of the engine does say twin entry turbo, but that just refers to the exhaust manifold design and the way that it fed the turbo. Nowadays, with modern turbochargers, we would refer to that as like a twin scroll design. Back then, they called it twin entry because, like he said, they had a different way of naming things. Turbocharging was kind of new. But rest assured that Toyota never made a twin turbo MR2.
There are 2 trunks. You come back here, lift it up, and it's a quite large trunk, as you can see. Decent space.
That's, I guess, kind of cool, but not super rare. I mean, the Acura NSX was the same idea too. It had a front trunk, and then it had a regular trunk behind the mid-engine. These cars had the engines so far forward, there's plenty of room for like a kind of a decent sized trunk. It's not really that crazy. I wouldn't really consider the frunk as usable storage space though, because the battery and the spare tire is up there on a completely stock MR2. Mine has a stereo system in it. It's kind of dirtier stuff in there, so you're not really going to put your groceries under the hood of an MR2. I think realistically it has one usable trunk.
And you can have the engine compartment and the trunk open separately. They don't like collide with each other like they do on some cars.
I guess that's a good comparison between Italian engineering and Japanese engineering.
But once you pull off both panels, you can see it creates kind of a convertible experience. They called it T-top.
It's funny that people talk about T-tops like they're such a foreign concept. And I guess if you think about it, we haven't seen these on a modern car in quite some time. But back in the 90s, it was pretty common.
Toyota did make a small handful of these MR2s with a real convertible top. It was called the MR Spider.
They were also all non-turbo, and most of them were automatic transmissions as well. So at the time, probably not a super desirable car, which is why they only sold 91 of them. And yet nowadays, because of the rarity, somehow they're cool, I guess, even though they're kind of girly.
By the way, one other interesting item on the subject of the T-tops, when you pull them off, this little panel pops up above the windshield frame. That's a wind deflector.
Surprisingly, those actually work a lot better than you would think too. I know when you're driving on the highway, if you actually reach up and hold it closed, there's quite a big difference in the amount of wind buffeting that happens.
And I mean all of the glass contains an etched VIN that matches the VIN of this car.
Fun fact, you'll see on the VIN number there in Doug's video that despite being referred to as the SW20 because of the chassis code, in North America, our turbo models were actually stamped as SW22 in the VIN number.
With that said, one other easy way to tell apart a turbo from a standard MR2 is the hood louvers. In back, the turbos had raised hood louvers that were just a little taller and a little more aggressive than the standard car, whose louvers were basically stamped flat into the hood.
I gotta give Doug credit here for getting this fact right, that I was expecting him to miss that. I was about to say, well, you can actually tell a turbo by the engine lid fins, but he got it. So kudos to you, Doug. I also, while I'm at it, I want to give him credit for not mentioning snap oversteer one single time in this video. And I think that's very refreshing because that sort of reputation has followed the MR2 for its entire life, and it is so blown out of proportion. Yeah, they can snap oversteer. The older models, the newer models, it doesn't matter. Yeah, they changed the suspension in 93, but they'll still do it. It's something that's common with mid-engine and rear-engine cars that have a short wheelbase. It's not a Toyota MR2 specific problem. It happens to the NSX, even happens to the S2000 cars like that are front mid-engine. It's actually a lot more common than people realize.
Well, the MR2 had these. They're very subtle, they're very basic, and they looked basically the same on the standard and turbo model.
Fun fact, the MR2 also had staggered tire sizes right from the factory. It had narrower ones up front and then wider ones in the back, which I don't think was very common at the time in the 90s.
Now, in the tuner scene, everybody takes off these wheels, but I personally like them.
I like mine better. One fun fact that Doug missed that I think you guys might find interesting is that these side vents on the car are functional on both sides. So the driver's side has the air box in it, so it's sucking air into the intake from that vent. And then the passenger side has the intercooler for the turbo right in that vent on that side. So it's sucking in air on both sides on purpose. So those vents are very functional.
The MR2 in general was a pretty racy looking car. In fact, people referred to it as a baby Ferrari, both the original MR2 and this one, because of its various design details.
Another very common misconception is that the Toyota MR2 copied the Ferrari 348 and 355 in terms of design elements, but people called it the poor man's Ferrari when in reality, the Ferrari was sort of the rich man's MR2 because the Toyota MR2 was designed and developed before the Ferrari 348 was. I think some of the confusion there is that there was a bunch of like Ferrari knockoff body kits that you could get to turn one of these MR2s into a fake Ferrari. So people just assumed that the Ferrari was the original, but believe it or not, this kind of body styling came from Toyota before it came from Ferrari.
There's some storage behind the seats. You fold the seat forward, you can see this little shelf here where you can put stuff if you want, and there's even a little strap that clips together to keep your stuff in place so it doesn't move around or fall out.
That shelf is actually the lid for a storage box. That opens up and there's like an actual compartment underneath there. So that's one little correction. Also, those straps are not intended to hold your luggage in place. Those are actually meant to hold the T-tops. So when you take the roof out, you put one T-top behind each of the seats and you can strap them in tight to the firewall to keep them from moving around and rattling. Toyota also included leather bags to put the T-tops into before you mounted them behind the seats to protect the glass.
Or you can open up the front panel and then it reveals some shelves in case you want to stick stuff on the shelves in your Toyota MR2.
That center storage box was actually designed to hold a stack of CD cases, believe it or not, which is so 90s.
I also like that there's a climate vent down below the dashboard on the driver's side that specifically blows air onto your legs or your thighs.
That's not for your legs or thighs, Doug. It's a ball cooler, and we love it.
I also like that when you open up the sun visor and put it down, you have a special warning label placed here that teaches you how to operate a turbocharged engines.
It actually gives you instructions for how to basically act as a turbo timer manually. It tells you to keep the engine running if you've been on the highway for a long time, or if you've been boosting and driving it really hard. You're supposed to let it idle for a little while and let it cool down a little bit before you shut it off.
You also had in the gauge cluster a little turbo boost gauge, front and center, so you could monitor your turbo boost.
That boost gauge was actually also another way of differentiating a turbo from a non-turbo model. The non-turbo models just had a voltage gauge there.
I remember when I was a kid, I'd see them around. I mean, they weren't that rare back then. They were a new car, and then they became like a slightly used car, and you'd sort of see them on the road. Now they're just completely gone.
The truth is, a lot of the MR2s that were originally out there have all since been crashed or written off. They were a little bit sketchy to drive if you didn't know how to drive, and a lot of people would wrap them around a pole. Or the other issue too is that a lot of them rusted out. Especially here in northern climates, and that's another reason why you just don't see very many of them anymore, and that kind of goes for any old Japanese car.
The clutch is notchier than I thought. It's not as like linear and progressive, which is a surprise because I feel like the Supra's clutch was pretty linear. This one though, there's a kick to it. You kind of come up a little bit and then you got to be careful at exactly the right bite point or else you're going to get a little bit of jerking.
I'm curious about the clutch that's in the car that Doug is driving here, because from what I remember about mine when it had a stock clutch in it, it was very linear and nothing worth mentioning. I've driven a Mark IV Supra as well, and from what I remember, they had very similar feeling clutches. Oh, heater turned on, okay.
200 horsepower probably doesn't seem all that much by modern standards, but this car weighs a lot less than anything you'll find in the modern era. It is a light car, and the engine is in the right place.
Yeah, the MR2 is definitely a light car compared to today's standards, and the SW20 was typically around like 2,900 pounds, which again, yeah, that's pretty light compared to today's cars. But for back then, it actually was a little bit heavy if you think about it, compared to say cars like the Miata or even Hondas like the Civic and Integra were coming in around like I think 2,500 pounds or something. So in some ways, especially compared to the first gen MR2, the second gen was a little bit porky.
And I fit in this car. I was a little concerned about that because it's a little car and it comes from Japan where people tend to be littler.
That's racist.
But that's not the situation. I fit just fine in here. I'm a reasonably tall person at 6'4", but I got headroom, I got legroom. Actually, the seat is even a little further back than I would want it.
I totally agree with that. I'm 6'3" myself, and I've had so many comments from people that are shocked that I can fit in this car, even to drive it at all, let alone be comfortable. But I find getting the angle of the seat is really crucial in being comfortable as a taller driver in an MR2 like this.
Such confidence in the handling in this car. I just love it.
I wouldn't get too comfortable there, Doug, because these cars can bite you if you push them past their limits. You got to have some quick hands because of that short wheelbase. Remember, there's no traction control, no stability control. There's not much there to save you from getting in over your head with these.
They're still probably undervalued considering the low production, especially for the turbos, and the wonderful driving experience that this car offers.
Oh, crap. Well, if you were hoping to buy one of these cars, it might be too late because Daddy Doug just said that they're undervalued, and I'm very interested to see what this does to the market on them now going forward.
I love the Mark IV Supra, but this is probably more fun. The Supra is more of a tourer than I think a lot of the internet realizes, but this car is your toss it around, ultra fun, lightweight sports car, and it's really cool.
Again, I've driven both the Supra and the MR2, and I love them both, and I think I would kind of agree with that. I can see where he's coming from, saying that the MR2 is more fun because it is smaller and easier to throw around. The Supra feels a bit more boaty. It feels very, very stable at highway speeds compared to the MR2. The MR2 is more darty, more twitchy. So for higher speeds, I think the Supra is definitely the better car, but if you're just carving corners and stuff, I think the MR2 is a little bit underrated. So I have to say, I think it's really cool that somebody with Doug's stature and the amount of experience that he has with other cars, I mean, he's basically driven and reviewed every car on the planet by this point. He's got access to some of the craziest vehicles out there. And to hear him speak so highly of the MR2, I think is really awesome. I was quite surprised to see it, to be honest, because it seems like until maybe recently, the Toyota MR2 was always sort of an underdog, and nobody was that excited about it. You know, it was always in the shadow of the Supra, and we can all agree the Mark IV Supra was a legendary car, and they've obviously skyrocketed in price. Then you had the NSX, which was sort of like the hero Japanese mid-engine car, and those have also skyrocketed in price. And so the MR2 was sort of like the little brother in that whole era of cars. It was sort of like the second tier. It's really cool to see the MR2 getting this kind of recognition, like 30 years later, I guess. Better late than never. I can't imagine what this is going to do to the market on these cars. I'm pretty glad that I own mine already, but it's cool to see them on the rise, and it's cool to see people appreciating them for what they are. So hopefully that clears things up a bit. To be honest, I saw this as an opportunity to talk about this car because I've been having kind of a hard time figuring out where this fits in on the channel. I'm going to be making a video all about why you should be buying one of these MR2s right now, and when I do, I'll put it on the screen here. Until then, I'm going to put another MR2 related video on the screen for you to check out next, because that side of the channel just doesn't really get many views, and if you're interested in this kind of stuff, if you think the car is cool, I do have a few videos out there already about it. Anyways, thanks for watching, guys, and I will see you next week. See ya!